Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome everybody to our event space and to this presentation on a topic that's of great interest to quite a lot of folks joining here this evening, an audience that includes veterinary professionals as well as dog owners, breeders, and trainers and enthusiasts on many levels. Our common thread is the dog tonight. My name is Dr. Sherry Berger, and I am pleased to be serving this evening as your host and moderator on behalf of VetVine. Tonight we're gathering here to talk about dogs. The second in our series of 5 webinars to be presented as part of our 2019 Canine Health Bites series. All of these programs have been made possible with the support of our partner in this series, the AKC Canine Health Foundation. And we thank CHF not only for their support of this series, but for all that they do on behalf of our canine companions and in funding important research with the intent of helping our dogs live longer, healthier, and happier lives. With that, I'm pleased to welcome back and introduce Andrea Fiumefreddo, who is the Director of Programs at the AKC Canine Health Foundation. Andrea oversees the Foundation's research and educational programs, and she's joining us here this evening to share a few words with you, our audience. So, Andrea, welcome back. I'm so glad you can be back here with us this evening.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Berger. I'm happy to be here on behalf of the AKC Canine Health Foundation and look forward to Dr. Bray's discussion of this important work. The AKC Canine Health Foundation has a history of funding for working dogs, including Dr. Bray's co-investigator, Dr. McLean, as well as his mentor, Dr. Brian Hare. Let's tune into the updates Dr. Bray has to share with us, which hopefully includes many pictures of her young four-legged cohorts observed during this study's data collection.
Thank you, Andrea. And again, please thank everyone at the Foundation for helping to make this evening possible. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our presenter this evening, Dr. Emily Bray. Dr. Bray has a very interesting educational background, and her focus on the study of dogs and their behavior began during her undergraduate studies at Duke University, where she majored in psychology and English. Dr. Bray went on to earn a master's degree and a PhD in psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, where the concentration of her studies was animal learning and behavior. She currently serves as a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Arizona School of Anthropology in Tucson, Arizona, and at Canine Companions for Independence, based in Santa Rosa, California, which is a non-for-profit that helps to place trained assistance dogs. The focus of her research includes the interplay between canine temperament and cognition and how early development affects later behavior in dogs. Her work is helping us to better understand and assess the heritability of cognitive and temperament traits in dogs, as well as their link to working dog success. So I am very grateful that she accepted the invitation to join us here. Dr. Bray, I say welcome, and the floor is now yours.
Wonderful. So I'm so excited to be here tonight. And first of all, a huge thank you to Dr. Berger, as well as to the AKC Canine Health Foundation for helping make this presentation possible. So as Dr. Berger mentioned, I went to undergrad at Duke University, where I became involved with one of the only dog research labs in the country, the Duke Canine Cognition Center. And here, pet owners, voluntarily bring in their dogs to be tested in fun cognitive games. And while there, I completed a senior thesis which investigated pet dogs' abilities to exert inhibitory control in different contexts. And I was also involved in a study of service dogs at Canine Companions for Independence, where we tested dogs in a series of cognitive tasks while they were in training. And the goal was to find responses to our tasks that would be predictive of success in the program. Then after graduating Duke, I started a PhD program in psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, where I actually spent my first summer doing field research in Masai Mara, Kenya, with hyenas, another highly social carnivore. And I spent a lot of time while there at the dens observing mother-cub interactions and nursing behaviors. And this experience became a huge source of inspiration in guiding my research questions about dogs moving forward. So when I got back to the States, I started my dissertation research in collaboration with the Seeing Eye, which is a guide dog organization. And I was again interested in predicting working dog success, but intrigued by the idea that those early days with the mother, fleeting though they may be, might have a larger influence than had previously been thought. And so I'll spend a lot of today talking about the results of that research. And since graduating 2 years ago, I've been a postdoctoral researcher at the Arizona Canine Cognition Center, and bringing things full circle, Canine Companions for Independence, where I've continued to address research questions relating to the effects of early life experience in dogs. So today, I'm going to spend some time going over what we already know about early life experience in dogs, and particularly time spent with the mother, and why we should care to study this topic further. I'll then go over what I found in my own research, the current studies that we're conducting to further that knowledge, and start to tease apart where we should go from here. And finally, at the end, I will address some of the questions that were submitted in advance of this talk. So, some of the earliest and most formative interactions that occur in any animal's life are those involving its mother. And across mammals, we know that early interactions with the mother often have long-term consequences for the development of their offspring in terms of stress responses, memory, exploratory tendencies, sociability, and anxiety, just to name a few. And rodents have actually probably been the most extensively studied in this regard. Specifically, researchers have observed the amounts of licking, grooming, and arched back nursing demonstrated by the mothers. And past studies have found that rodent pups raised by mothers who display high levels of grooming and nursing show better spatial memory and exhibit muted stress responses when compared to offspring raised by mothers who display low levels of these behaviors. Similarly, we know that maternal style has long-lasting effects in macaques. So in this species, individual differences in maternal behaviors have prompted researchers to classify them along different scales. So rejection, which is measured by how much they tolerate contact, carrying, and nursing their infants, as well as protection, measured by how much grooming they do and how much time they spend in proximity with their infants. And it turns out that monkeys with rejecting mothers were more anxious at 2 years old, but also more willing to initiate social contact with other group members. And monkeys raised by protective mothers were less exploratory. And even in our own species, protective as well as harmful effects on later adolescent behavior can be traced, at least in part, back to parenting style. So the question that we're all interested in today is, how does mothering affect dog behavior? So first of all, why is it important to investigate the long-term effects of mothering in dogs? Historically, it appears that people haven't really taken mothering into account as an influential driver of later puppy behavior. In the literature, it's really difficult to find studies addressing these sorts of questions in dogs. And furthermore, 2 different studies have asked breeders about top considerations when selecting breeding stock. And so in a study of 1,000 dog breeders from France, maternal care was not cited as a factor that breeders took into consideration at all. And in a different study of 300 breeders from Australia, only breeders from the toy and hound breed groups acknowledged it as an important feature. However, I would argue that there are several good reasons why we should very much care. So for starters, understanding what constitutes a healthy rearing environment and mother-offspring relationship is beneficial to the dogs themselves. By understanding how interactions during those first few critical weeks postpartum affect the mother and her litter, the puppies can be preferentially exposed to a maternal environment that builds resilience and reduces later stress and anxiety. We could also actively avoid breeding dams who might be overly stressed by motherhood and who might not provide optimal care for their young. And so whether you're a veterinarian, a breeder, a trainer, or a pet owner, this topic should be of great interest and relevance to you. So for example, one question that someone asked was, what can breeders do to improve maternal behaviors in the dogs? But in order to answer that question, we first need to get a firm grasp on what improved maternal behavior actually looks like, and acknowledge that it might differ depending on the outcome that you're hoping the puppy will achieve later in life. Relatedly, if we're able to determine the underlying biological mechanisms that lead to a mother acting the way that she does, as well as the biological mechanisms by which her actions are affecting her offspring, we will be in a much better position to design interventions or give advice moving forward. So for example, a study in rats found that high amounts of early maternal care led to increased oxytocin receptor binding in female offspring as adults. And more research is needed in dogs to determine how varying levels of maternal behavior affect offspring levels of oxytocin. In fact, preliminary work exploring oxytocin biomarkers in dogs reveals that these neuropeptides are associated with individual differences in dog behavior and responsive to forms of social contact. And finally, on the more applied side, understanding the impacts of maternal style will allow working dog organizations to improve the dog's earliest and most formative experiences. And the hope is that by facilitating healthy, happy, and resilient dogs from those first few weeks, these dogs will be better prepared to face the cognitive and temperament challenges awaiting them on the job, resulting ultimately in lower attrition rates from working dog programs. So in reading your pre-submitted questions, it really stood out to me how little we know about the long-term effects of early maternal interaction. And in fact, when we say that we want to know more about a puppy's early maternal interactions, that topic actually encompasses a broad array of time points, behaviors, and experiences. So the interaction between mother and pups really starts at conception, before the puppies even exist in the outside world. Pregnancy in dog lasts for approximately 2 months, at which point the whelp occurs. And then we can start thinking about the puppy's early life with the mother in 2 distinct phases. So the first 3 weeks, when pups are still developing their sense of sight and hearing and undergoing rapid neurological development, and then the weeks following that up until weaning, at which point most dogs are separated permanently from their mother. And at each of these stages, there are multiple factors that we suspect are potentially affecting the puppies and having consequences for their future development. And I say that we suspect this because there are extremely few, if any, scientific studies on many of the things that I'm about to mention, and it's even rarer that those studies follow the pups long enough to determine the long-term effects. So often what we know is just presumed from studies in other species. So during pregnancy, we assume that everything from what the mother eats to the levels of stress she's experiencing might have an impact on the fetuses. And we might also expect age and experience to play a role, although those 2 variables are often confounded in that older dogs have typically had more litters than younger dogs. So there is one study that found first-time mothers steadily increased their maternal care over the first 3 weeks, resulting in higher levels of maternal behavior during the 3rd week of life compared to mothers that had had more than 1 litter. However, mothers with more than 1 litter show more constant levels of maternal behavior over the first 3 weeks. And these findings mirror what I found in my own studies, where at week 2, the more experienced the mother was, the less maternal behavior she displayed. And then we have factors that might play a role during the whelp. And so these are things like, did the mother give birth naturally or have to be anesthetized for a C-section? And if she did give birth naturally, how active a role did she play in terms of breaking the sac, chewing the umbilical cord, et cetera? And how many pups did she end up having? During those early weeks of life, we're interested in how the mother actually interacts with her puppies. Does she have a steady milk supply? It's at this point where we also might start to see some epigenetic effects come into play. So in other words, are her interactions affecting the gene expression of her puppies? And finally, as the puppies age and develop their little personalities, how are those later weeks with the mother important? So what sorts of things are they picking up from her, and at what age should they wean and be taken away? So my research thus far has largely focused on the days and weeks right after birth, which is when rapid neurological development is occurring in the puppies. And furthermore, I've been really interested in observing and documenting maternal behaviors. And so that is what I'll focus on in today's webinar. So as it turns out, despite the fact that dogs are everywhere in our society, there have only been a handful of very recent studies specifically linking maternal style to later behavior in dogs. So in the first such study, which happened as recently as 2015, the researchers, Tira and Lohi, were interested in the effect of environmental factors on offspring anxiety. So they reached out to over 3,000 Finnish dog owners, and to determine the maternal care that the puppies received, they simply asked the owners to report on a 1 to 7 scale, how did the mother of your dog take care of her puppies? And here, a 1 meant that the mother was so inadequate that the pups were bottle fed or taken to a surrogate, whereas a 7 meant that the owners reported that the mother took extremely good care of the puppies and spent a lot of time with them. And the authors found a significant association between low levels of maternal care in puppyhood and high instances of fear at 6 months of age or older. And they also found that the dogs with several anxieties had lower levels of maternal care as puppies and were separated later from their mother. So while this study is intriguing in that it implicates maternal care as an important factor, it admittedly was a rather rough measure of maternal care, and it was reported by the dog's owner as opposed to the breeder. So they recommend further research where maternal behavior is directly measured. And that is exactly what this next study does. So Guardini and colleagues actually quantified maternal behavior by directly observing the amount of contact, grooming, and nursing displayed by the mothers over the first 21 days. And then they had the puppies participate in 2 behavioral tests at 58 to 60 days of age. So the first test was an arena test in which the puppies spent 5 minutes in an area with an unfamiliar experimenter and a variety of toys. And the second test was an isolation test in which puppies spent 3 minutes in a novel room they had never been in by themselves. And the researchers found associations between levels of maternal care that they had recorded over those first 3 weeks and the puppy's behavior during the isolation task. So specifically, higher maternal care was positively correlated with exploration and a longer latency to vocalize, and negatively correlated with stressful behaviors like whining and yelping and increased movement. A second study by the same group in pet dogs this time found essentially the opposite results. So here, higher levels of maternal care were associated with more stress behaviors and less exploration and play. So these differences raise interesting questions about how amount of maternal care potentially differs between populations of dogs, as well as how maternal care combines with other aspects of the early environment to affect later puppy characteristics. Finally, a third study looked at the influence of maternal behavior on the temperament of the offspring as young adults. So here, maternal behavior was again tracked over the first 3 weeks postpartum, this time in a population of military German Shepherd dogs. And then puppies participated in a temperament test at 15 to 18 months of age. And again, the authors found an association between maternal behavior and later puppy behavior, this time up to 1.5 years later. So dogs with more involved mothers were more interested in people, were more comfortable in novel environments, such as on metal stairs or shaky tables, and they were more aggressive. So, as part of my dissertation work, I wanted to extend this research and continue exploring the effects of maternal behavior, specifically in assistance dogs. So assistance dog organizations are ideal for this kind of work, as they breed large amounts of dogs in a fairly similar environment that allows for systematic observation. There is also an outcome, which depends on the dog achieving a high standard with regards to temperament and cognition. So for example, in the day-to-day work of guide dogs, they need to be motivated to learn and perform while also able to rest quietly for hours at a time while their handlers are at work, for example. Guide dogs are also often faced with tasks demanding complex actions, such as paying attention to relevant material, like the flow of traffic, while ignoring distractors, such as people wanting to play. And they also have to differentiate among subtle commands and exhibit flexibility in decision-making. So with this in mind, I partnered with the Seeing Eye, which is the oldest guide dog school in the United States. And the first part of the study was conducted at their breeding station in Chester, New Jersey, where I was able to observe mothers and their litters over the first few weeks of life. And the breeds that I observed consisted of German Shepherds, Labrador Retrievers, Golden Retrievers, and Lab Golden Crosses that came from 21 different litters for a total of 138 puppies. The second main phase of data collection took place at Seeing Eye headquarters in Morristown, New Jersey, and this is where the professional training of dogs and their blind handlers takes place. And here, 133 of the original 138 dogs returned to campus around 16 months of age, and they participated in cognitive and temperament testing before entering professional training. So the overall design of the project consisted of 4 main stages that spanned 2 years and were specifically mapped onto the life history of a typical seeing eye dog. So all of the puppies are born at their breeding station, where they remain with their mothers for the first 6 weeks. And it's during that time that we were able to observe them, perform some experiments and hormone analysis on those 21 litters. Then, around 7 weeks, the puppies are vaccinated and sent out to their puppy raisers. And these are volunteer families that essentially take these dogs in for the first year or so of their lives. They provide basic socialization, basic training, and during that time, we don't have access to the dogs in terms of being able to perform behavioral tests, but we are able to check in with the puppy raisers who fill out surveys at 6 and 12 months. And those surveys include things like the Canine Behavioral Research Questionnaire, which was developed by Dr. James Serpel at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as an attention and activity impulsivity questionnaire that was designed initially for humans, but since adapted to dogs and has been validated in dogs by a canine cognition group in Hungary. So after being with the puppy raiser, the dogs all turn back in for training, and it's at that point that they again participate in these cognitive and temperament tests prior to starting training. And then finally, we wait to see what outcome the dog receives. So is it released from the program, or is it successfully placed as a graduate or breeder? So our first question, how can we quantify maternal style over those first few weeks of life? So to do this, I videotaped mothers with their litters over the first 3 weeks postpartum. They participated 3 days per week between the hours of 9 a.m. and 6 p.m., and we would record 4 10-minute focals each day for a total of just under 7,000 observation minutes with an average of over 300 minutes per litter. And as we just went over, there have been 3 other studies linking maternal style to later puppy outcomes. And so many of our behavioral measures were based off of measures in those studies. And I tracked these interactions as a proxy for the quantity and quality of maternal care. So what exactly were these measures? First of all, how much time is the mother choosing to spend in proximity to her puppies? And so all the mothers give birth in these plastic kiddie pools, the whelping pools, that remain in their respective kennels, so they can be choosing to be in there close to the puppies or elsewhere within their kennel at any given time. We're also really interested in tracking the nursing interactions, which, as you guys know, is a huge part of mothering. And something that we did differently than in past studies is that we actually took into account the position from which the mother was nursing. So to explain that, I'm going to show you a video. This mother is displaying lateral nursing, so she's lying on her side. This is ventral nursing. She's still close to the puppies, but she's lying on her stomach. And then finally, we have vertical nursing, which is nursing from a sitting or standing position, and that makes it a little more difficult for the puppies to latch on and stay attached. In addition to looking at nursing, we also looked at how much time the mother spent in contact with her puppies, how much time she spent licking and grooming them. And then also, this was another behavior that had not been documented in the other studies, but we noticed in our population, this orienting away behavior. So she's in the pool with her puppies, but her attention is directed elsewhere into the main pavilion, and we saw this as a sort of vigilance behavior. So, principal components analysis, or PCA, is a data reduction technique that describes data in fewer dimensions based on their underlying correlations. And the simplification allows us to interpret our data more easily. So another way to think about PCA is that it answers the question, are different variables driven by the same underlying variable? So I applied PCA to our maternal observation data. And what you can see here is that all aspects of maternal behavior loaded highly onto one single component, which we termed maternal behavior. So essentially what this means is that mothers who are choosing to spend a lot of time with their puppies are also highly interactive. So they're spending lots of time in contact with their puppies, licking and grooming them, nursing them from all three positions, and displaying these vigilance behaviors. And this principal component explains a significant portion of the variance and was highly stable among mothers across weeks. So we therefore concluded that our principal component might constitute a useful characterization of mothers' behavioral styles. So all mothers observed were then assigned a maternal behavior score, which ranged from high to low. And I'd like to break it back down into the raw variables very quickly that made up the component, because that will make more intuitive sense than showing you the principal component score. So what you can see here is the range displayed by the mothers in the study, as well as the average amount of time spent displaying each behavior across dams. So for example, the mother that spent the most time in the pool with her puppies was observed in the pool 93% of the time during those video recordings, whereas the mother that spent the least time in the pool was only there 20% of the time in our recordings. And across all mothers, they averaged just over half of the time we spent observing them in the pool. You can also see that some behaviors, such as nursing and contact, were much more common than others, such as licking and grooming and vigilance behaviors. Okay, so now I'm going to show you guys another video just to give you guys a visual. So first we have here an example of a dog displaying relatively high levels of maternal behavior, which would translate into a high score on our maternal behavior principal component. So you can see she's in the pool, she's in close proximity, she's nursing, she's licking and grooming, she's displaying these vigilance behaviors. Even when she's out of the pool, she's interacting with the puppies. And I just want to compare this to a dog sort of on the other end of the spectrum, displaying relatively low levels, which would translate into a lower score on her maternal behavior component. And you can see she is not nearly as interactive with her puppies, even when they are sort of actively soliciting her attention. Okay, next we asked, can we validate our approach by showing expected correlations to other experimental and endocrine measures of maternal care? So other studies have also found that maternal behavior groups together onto one principal component, so that's promising. However, no one has ever validated this component by determining if it's associated with other independent measures of mothering that were not used to build the component in the first place. So this is what we did next. First, we collected an experimental measure. So once a week, over the first 3 weeks, I would enter the mother's pen for 3 minutes while she was nursing her puppies. And then we simply recorded the time that she spent with her puppies. So the goal was first to place the mother in a situation where she would have to choose between her puppies and an inviting distraction, and then to determine if her choices could be predicted based on her mothering style as measured by her score on the maternal behavior principal component. So again, I'm going to show you a video of what that looks like and sort of the two extremes that we saw. So I always followed a set script. You can see I enter the pen and I greet the dog. If the dog approaches me, I interacted with her. Then I spent a minute sitting, still interactive if the dog was nearby. Then 1 minute ignoring the dog. You can see this dog still would rather spend time with me. And then I leave. So this dog essentially left her puppies the moment I entered and stayed away the entire time. And that's in comparison. Here's a dog on the other end of the spectrum. I go through the exact same script where I enter and greet, and I stand there for a minute, and you can see she doesn't appear to be interested in coming to say hi. She would rather stay with her puppies. There's me ignoring her, and then I leave. So, as we would expect, mothers who scored high on the maternal behavior principal component, so again, those that are regularly spending the most time in the whelping pool, physically contacting, nursing, and grooming their puppies in their daily lives, also spent the most time with their puppies during the experiment, even in the face of a salient distraction. We also collected saliva from the mothers in order to look at salivary cortisol, which is commonly used as a measure of stress levels. So 1 night a week for the first 2 weeks, we would collect a baseline measure a couple of hours after dinner. Then we would temporarily remove half the pups in the dam's litter for 5 minutes. And this was meant to be a slight stressor, but within the realm of their normal experience because the puppies were removed daily to be weighed over the first few weeks anyway. And then after the separation, we took post-stressor measures of salivary cortisol as well. So what we found is that pre-stressor baseline salivary cortisol of the mothers was positively associated with our principal component, maternal behavior. So in other words, mothers who were exhibiting higher levels of maternal behavior also had higher cortisol levels in general. Additionally, mothers who ranked high on contact, proximity, nursing, grooming, and orienting out in both weeks also showed the largest peaks in salivary cortisol after being briefly separated from half of their litter. So it does appear that our maternal behavior component is consistent with other independently measured indicators of a dam's mothering style. So on to the next question. Can we see an effect of maternal style during the first few weeks of life on offspring temperament and cognition up to a year and a half later? So we've been able to quantify maternal style. Now we want to know if and how it's affecting the puppies down the road. And in fact, yes, we do see an association between maternal style experienced during early life and performance on behavioral experiments administered when the dogs were young adults about to enter training. And what we find is that high levels of maternal behavior appear to be associated with negative outcomes, and especially in 3 specific tasks: an isolation task, a novel object task, and an independent problem-solving task. So highly mothered dogs showed higher activity levels in the isolation task and a quicker latency to vocalize during the novel object task, which are both potential signs of stress and anxiety. And finally, they were also worse at the problem-solving task. So not only did they take longer to solve it, but they continued to pursue an unproductive solution even when it wasn't yielding the result that they wanted. So I found the multi-step problem-solving task result particularly exciting because the association between maternal style and behavior shows up for a cognitive skill. And this is pretty scarce in the literature, which often focuses on differences in temperament. So I designed this task to measure problem solving as well as perseveration. And so we have here, this is a Nina Addison dog toy. You can get it on Amazon. The top part rotates, and for the test portion of the experiment, we hide a treat in one of the wells and then rotate the top and place a bone in a different empty well. So the dog must first remove the bone and then rotate the apparatus to successfully retrieve the treat, and it has to be in that order. And a dog could fail this for a number of reasons, and we wanted to rule out that the dog simply wasn't motivated or didn't understand how to manipulate the apparatus. So we have 3 preliminary tests. And so the warm-up trials allow us to ensure that the dog is physically capable of solving the task. So each of the necessary components is tested separately. So first, are the dogs motivated to eat the food? That really wasn't an issue. Next, that they're able to physically rotate the apparatus and figure out that part. And then finally, that they can remove the bone. And there's definitely different strategies that can be successful. They can paw at it, they can nose it out, they can pick it up by the little string. And all dogs that went on to the test had passed these warm-ups. So now I'm showing you this first dog doing the task, and this is a dog that had experienced relatively high levels of maternal care as a puppy. We're speeding it up, but what you're seeing is a lot of perseveration. So he's really interested in where he knows the treat is, even though it's not really getting him anything until he finally solves it. And that's compared to this dog who experienced relatively low levels of maternal care doing the same task. Here's the test trial. And what we really see is that there is no perseveration, and he's able to solve it pretty quickly. And talk about the novel object task, which was another task in which performance differed based on the amount of maternal care experienced over those first few weeks of life. So in this task, dogs spent 2 minutes alone in a room with these rather creepy toy cats. They were motion activated, and they made erratic movements and strange noises. And again, I'm going to show you 2 dogs doing this. And again, the first one had experienced relatively high levels of maternal care. You can see led into the room. And almost immediately, is barking and vocalizing at the cats. And again, this is compared to a dog who had experienced relatively low levels of maternal care. And I go ahead and speed it up throughout the 2 minutes, but at no point did this dog ever vocalize. So now, this brings us to one of our big overarching questions, which is, can we see an effective maternal style during the first few weeks of life on success in the guide dog program up to 2 years later? So in order to look at how maternal behavior is potentially related to success or failure, we need to know outcomes in the population that we studied. So here, success is defined as graduating as a guide or being handpicked to join the breeding program, thus passing on genes to future generations. And just over half of our sample was successful, so 52.9%, whereas 27% of our sample failed for behavioral reasons. And this included things such as lack of confidence, excitability, and inability to focus. And since we were only interested in the associations between maternal style and later behavioral measures, I excluded from analysis the 28 dogs that failed for medical reasons or transfer. And then I used a linear model with outcome as the dependent variable and the principal component maternal behavior as the predictor variable. Our modeling allowed us to control for litter effects, and then we also accounted for breed, birth season, maternal parity, sex of puppy, and age at return by including them as covariates. And what we find is a positive, significant association, meaning that high levels of maternal behavior are associated with failure. And we can look at the odds ratio to determine that, in fact, the odds of a dog being released from the program were over 3 times higher with each standard deviation increase in maternal behavior. Out of curiosity, I also wanted to examine the effect of the different behaviors separately, since we included some that others had never looked at before. And you can see that 2 types of nursing are highly significant, but their estimates are going in opposite directions. So puppies exposed to high levels of ventral nursing were more likely to be released, and in contrast, puppies exposed to vertical nursing were less likely to be released. So initially, I found these results somewhat surprising. In other words, puppies whose mother had a higher score on the maternal behavior component were more likely to fail. And moreover, we see that all nursing is not equal. So how can this be explained? As Parker and Meister-Bray point out in a review of the primate literature, many studies have traditionally focused on extreme disruptions of the parent-offspring relationship, such as complete isolation or instances of abuse and neglect. And in these scenarios, trauma in childhood causes stress and is overwhelmingly associated with vulnerability in adulthood, with poorer outcomes in terms of cognition, fear, and anxiety. Normal parenting, in contrast, is associated with low levels of stress and much better adult outcomes. So this paints a picture of a linear relationship between parental style-induced stress and later offspring outcome. However, Parker and Meister-Bray argue for a more nuanced picture. A little bit of stress in early life might not be a bad thing, and in fact can even have inoculating effects. So they show in a population of squirrel monkeys that repeated short-term separations early on gave young animals a chance to prevail over small challenges. So they propose that the relationship between levels of maternal behavior and offspring outcome is quadratic, where extremely low levels of maternal behavior are obviously bad, but so are extremely high levels, as they don't give young animals the chance to experience and then learn to deal with stress. So going back to the seeing eyes population, the baseline of care was very high to begin with. Mothers are housed with 24/7 access to their puppies, and even well before 8 weeks, the staff will supplement a puppy's diet if they aren't gaining weight. So really, there's no extreme instances of deprivation, neglect, or abuse. So this side of the curve is essentially non-existent. And among mothers that are all essentially good mothers, we would actually expect lower overall levels of maternal behavior to be associated with the best outcomes, while higher levels of maternal behavior would be associated with worse outcomes. So if their mother is always around and interacting with them, perhaps her pups don't ever get a chance to deal with small stressors at the detriment to their later success in the program. And in fact, our data fits this prediction. So in this population of sufficient mothers, less involved mothers are yielding higher rates of successful puppies than more involved mothers. And the other results fit with this story as well. Like overall levels of maternal behavior, high levels of ventral nursing are linked to failure. Ventral nursing was easier for the pups, as it involved mothers lying immobile on their stomachs with their nipples at the pup's face level, making it easy for puppies to latch on and stay attached. In contrast, high levels of vertical nursing were linked to success, and in this nursing style, mothers nursed while sitting or standing, making it a more active, difficult, and effortful endeavor for puppies. So while our study finds a strong effect of maternal style, future research is needed to further elucidate the mechanisms behind it. So as I just explained, one hypothesis is that facing small obstacles early in life is beneficial for later working dog success. In line with this finding, the 2015 Tira and Lohi article that we discussed earlier compared litters that remained in their permanent home for the whelp versus going to a different home for the whelp. And they found that puppies born of the transplanted females were actually less fearful and noise sensitive compared to puppies born of mothers who stayed in their permanent home. And they hypothesized that this change in environment prior to the whelp was a mild stressor for the mother that was then transferred to the pups, but with actually beneficial results later on. I should mention that there are other hypotheses as to why we may be seeing this pattern, and they are not necessarily mutually exclusive. So for example, genetics could be at play. So the mother's behavior could potentially be an artifact of the dog's genetic makeup contributing to a specific temperament, which is then inherited by the puppy. And finally, we know that the tough love mothers in our study also exhibited lower cortisol increases when their pups were temporarily removed. So maybe having a more relaxed mother is part of the picture as well. So what are the next steps in this line of research? So to look at the generalizability of the maternal style guide dog results, I am now continuing to investigate maternal style in future assistance dogs. So to this end, I've started a study funded by the AKC Canine Health Foundation with my co-PI, Dr. Evan McLean. And in this study, we've been working with the dogs at Canine Companions for Independence. So just to give you guys a brief background about Canine Companions, they are a nonprofit assistance dog organization that places dogs across 5 different categories. Service dogs are paired with adults with physical disabilities and can do things like pick up dropped items, pull open a door, and turn on the lights. Hearing dogs can alert their deaf or hard of hearing owner to key sounds, such as an alarm clock or a doorbell. Skilled companions are placed with an adult or child with a disability under the guidance of a facilitator. So for example, a parent might facilitate their child and a dog. Facility dogs are placed with a person who has need of their services in a professional setting, such as a hospital or courtroom. And recently, Canine Companions now places assistance dogs for veterans, and these are dogs that provide emotional and physical support during the transition back to civilian life. And so these dogs enter professional training around 18 months of age, and like guide dogs, they need to meet a strict set of criteria to be successful. So for example, they need to be capable of memorizing up to 40 commands and motivated to perform them, able to control their impulses, and extremely attentive to their handlers, all while demonstrating an even-keeled temperament. And all of these dogs start as puppies in Canine Companions' breeding population. So pictured here are the first 3 dams that we enrolled in the study back in January of 2018, and we have since enrolled 40 more, and our goal is to reach 60 litters total over the course of the study. And the study this time actually begins pre-pregnancy when in-season dams arrive at Canine Companions. So prior to breeding, dams participate in cognition and temperament testing, and we're also able to collect measures that allow us to look at cortisol and oxytocin levels. And then when the mothers whelp, we again record videos over the first 3 weeks and code them for maternal behaviors. Then, when all the puppies are about 8 weeks old, they return to campus for a checkup and vaccine before going to live with their puppy raisers. And at this point, the puppies participate in cognition and temperament testing at 8 weeks, and they're actually able to complete all of the same tasks that their dams were also tested on pre-pregnancy. So we have several key objectives with the current study, which we started to replicate and extend the findings of the Seeing Eye study. So first of all, the previous findings arose in a population of guide dogs, so it's an empirical question as to whether we will see similar effects in a population of assistance dogs. So one of the pre-submitted questions asks, Mother dogs do not interact with all puppies in a similar manner. For example, they have their favorites. How is this differential interaction between mother and an individual pup being followed? Excellent question. So, an additional component of this new study is that over the first 3 weeks, every puppy is wearing a unique color-coded collar and marked with a strategically positioned dot so that we'll be able to tell them apart in video recordings. And that is going to allow us to determine if experience with the mother varies or stays constant across the pups in a litter, and again, how that maps onto each specific puppy's later outcome. These markings also mean that even in infrared light, we have the ability to individually identify the pups. So rather than just observing the behavior during daylight hours, like I did at the Seeing Eye, we can observe them over the nighttime hours as well. And furthermore, while our past research has examined how mothering style affects puppy behavior, we also expect that it might impact hormone levels as well. And this will allow us to start to get at our questions about underlying mechanisms. So to this end, we will also be collecting biological samples, this time around from the puppies in weeks 6 and 8 in the form of feces and plasma, which will allow us to start to look for associations between maternal style and early cortisol and oxytocin levels. Canine Companions also offers a unique opportunity to explore the effect of early rearing environment on mothering style and puppy behavior. So many litters are actually whelped and weaned by volunteer breeder caretakers in a home environment. However, some litters are whelped and weaned in a dedicated on-campus early development center staffed by around-the-clock technicians. So by comparing litters whelped and weaned in private homes to the ones whelped and weaned in the professional center, we can learn more about how this might affect the mother's behavior and which parts of the environment are important to development. And it will also allow us to figure out the most positive influences and try to enhance those features in both environments moving forward. And I think it's important to note that these findings won't necessarily be specific to just working dogs. It also addresses questions that come up for breeders of other types of dogs as well, such as the effect of changing a mother's environment right before the whelp. And additionally, we have started measuring the temperament, cognitive, and hormone profiles of mothers pre-pregnancy and looking for correlation between these things and later mothering style. So as things currently stand, accounting for a dam's maternal style is impossible if the dam has never had a litter before. So if we can start to prospectively determine which mothers will be best suited for motherhood before they even give birth, everyone benefits, the mothers, the puppies, and the people that they're ultimately going to help. So, in conclusion, mothering matters, but in moderation. While surprisingly few studies have directly observed maternal behavior in dogs over the puppy's first few weeks of life, so far all of them have found important implications for later pup behavior and outcome. And in expanding this work to different populations of dogs and different models of early care, we're hoping to continue to elucidate the role that the mother plays. Ultimately, research into this topic could lead to more informed selection of breeders, as well as refinement of the practices by which puppies are whelped and raised until weaning. So before I take questions, a thank you to the many, many people and organizations who have been involved in and supported this research: the University of Pennsylvania, the Seeing Eye, the University of Arizona Canine Cognition Center, and Canine Companions for Independence, where I currently work, as well as our funding sources. And I always like to point out that this research would not happen without the undergraduates. So I've been so lucky to work with some amazing undergrads from Penn, Franklin and Marshall, the University of Arizona, Princeton, and Sonoma State University, who have poured their hearts and time into these projects. And thanks, of course, to you guys for listening to me today. And in the remaining time, I'd like to address some questions that were submitted ahead of the talk. And so first of all, just to return to this slide, a lot of you had questions about the effect of the mother that fell outside of the narrow window that I talked about today. And as I've said, unfortunately, there's a lot of really excellent questions that I cannot speak to because we just don't have any solid scientific data yet, although you've given me lots of wonderful ideas for future research, so thank you for that. However, I would like to address some of the questions as best I can. So for example, a lot of you were wondering about how a C-section versus natural whelp affects mothering style. And I think particularly a worry might be that the maternal instincts don't kick in because the natural birthing process wasn't allowed to occur. And so unfortunately, this isn't something that has been explicitly studied. I can speak to it, but please take this with a huge grain of salt as the sample size is so low that it's essentially anecdotal. But of the 21 mothers in my maternal style study at the CNI, 3 of them delivered by cesarean section. And in looking back at the data in week 2, they were all either average or higher on all the maternal behavioral dimensions that we measured: proximity, nursing, contact, licking, grooming, and vigilance. So, and again, this is a tiny sample size, but for what it's worth, at least in these 3 dogs, it doesn't appear to have drastically stripped them of all maternal instincts. Another question that came up was how litter size affects maternal behavior. So, for example, does having a singleton versus a multi-pup litter matter? And while in the populations that I've studied, singletons are extremely rare and have not been included, the size of litters that I have looked at, it's ranged from 2 to 10 pups. And what I and others have found is that there is an effect of litter size on maternal behavior, whereby mothers of larger litters display a lower quantity of maternal care. And this mirrors what is found in mice as well. And it's probably not that surprising, since it's physically difficult for a mother of 10 to interact with each individual puppy at the same rate as a mother of 2. And tending to larger litters is likely more demanding and exhausting, potentially leading the mother to spend less time with them. But that being said, litter size wasn't simply redundant with our maternal behavior component, meaning that there's more than just the size of the litter that is determining how a mother cares for her puppies. And furthermore, when we look at how maternal style affects later outcome and include litter size as a covariate, maternal style has a significant association with the outcome, whereas litter size does not. Okay, many people were also wondering about what age the puppy should leave their mother. And so again, my research does not speak directly to this question, since in the studies that I've told you about today, there was no variation in the age at which that happens. However, there have been a couple of studies that have some interesting things to say about how a mother staying with her puppies through those later weeks can influence their social behaviors. So the first one is by Eric Wilson, who was observing a population of military German Shepherd dogs from 3 to 8 weeks postpartum. From the 3rd week on, he observed a steady decrease in nursing, and this is actually true, at least in my studies, from the 1st week on. That's just a general trend as leading up to weaning. But starting at the 4th week, he also observed mothers holding pups' heads or muzzles in their mouths to actively stop suckling. Starting at the 5th week, he observed a behavior he called inhibited bite and growling towards the pups. And even though all these dogs were the same breed, he documented individual differences in how aggressively they performed these sort of weaning behaviors toward their pups. And upon testing those pups at 8 weeks of age, he did find a correlation wherein those that had been most aggressively punished by their mothers, they were least likely to make contact with humans and slower to fetch in these tests. So he concludes that the way the mother interacts with the puppy, and not necessarily how the mother interacts with humans, has implications for how the puppies interact with humans at 8 weeks. And just a few cautions in how to interpret these findings. First is that the causality can't be confirmed, so it could just be that the more aggressive mothers might simply be reacting to more noisy or violent offspring. And also, the follow-up stopped at 8 weeks, so we aren't sure if these behavioral differences would persist into adulthood. And finally, in a second study conducted in 95 puppies from 20 litters of working German Shepherd dogs, Slabert and Rasa separated some pups from their mothers, who were either trained or untrained in narcotics retrieval, at the standard 6 weeks, while allowing others to stay with their trained or untrained mothers until 12 weeks. And during this time, a subset of the extended maternal care group, so those staying with their mothers for 12 weeks, were allowed to observe their mother successfully retrieving narcotics. Then, at 12 weeks, all pups were separated if they hadn't been previously, and no further training took place. And then at 6 months, all of the puppy participants were scored on their own aptitude for narcotics work, having never participated in it themselves. And what they found was that the pups with extended maternal care that had also observed their trained mothers performing narcotics work significantly outperformed all other groups 3 months later without any further reinforcement. And the study design meant that the result couldn't just be explained by simply staying with the mother for longer or by inherited aptitude of the mother's skill. So rather, the opportunity for observational learning at this young age was beneficial for later task performance, which is kind of interesting. Okay, so those are the questions that I thought were most applicable to the audience at large, and I just want to thank you guys again for tuning in tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Bray. That was some great information. Again, we want to thank the AKC Canine Health Foundation for bringing tonight's program to us. So with that, folks, I want to thank you for joining us.